Quick disclaimer before getting started. To keep this tutorial's runtime shorter, this video assumes you're using the project files from my Gumroad. You can still follow along without them, but prior knowledge of UE5 landscape materials and PCGs will be helpful. To get started today, we're going to need to grab a real-world height map using satellite data. There's a fantastic free tool. I'm going to leave a link in the video description. It allows you to pan around and pull height maps from a variety of sources, as well as color maps and street view maps. So it really is a very useful tool. But if you don't know yet where you want to grab a height map from, the best way that I've found is to use Google Maps. And if you're going to use Google Maps, go down to your layer properties in the bottom left and make sure that you have globe view on. And what this will allow you to do is look around the Earth in a projected 3D. This is a really easy way to get an understanding of some basic elevational differences and to really pick out some interesting spots. Once you have a spot that you find interesting, you can right-click on it and copy the coordinates. I have a notepad open here, and I usually just copy-paste the coordinates there, so I have them for reference later on. Then you can hop back over to your Unreal PNG heightmap tool and just take those coordinates from before and paste them into the latitude and longitude boxes down below. For today's tutorial, however, I have a different location in mind. Just off the coast of Tokyo is a very beautiful island called Hachijojima, and on that island are two volcanoes. I thought it'd be quite fitting, considering the first tutorial I did had one mountain, so let's make the Gaea 2.0 tutorial have two mountains. As I'm getting everything lined up here for the height map export, take note of the dimensions of this, a 20 by 20 kilometer export. This time around, I think I'm going to do more of a game scale representation rather than 1:1. I might do 1:20 scale. And once you have everything lined up, go ahead and click on Generate Height Map, and it should automatically download the height map of the area you have selected. If you also want to save a snapshot of the topography or the world imagery of this area as well, you can do that by clicking on the Generate Albedo from View, and that will compose the tiles and automatically download it as well. Now that we have everything exported, let's hop over to Gaea 2.0, and here you'll see a familiar scene if you followed my previous tutorial on Gaea 1.0. I thought a lot about how to approach this tutorial, and I decided the best way to go about it was to start with a new landscape and show you how I would change things to adapt the file format. I'm going to be explaining each node one by one, so if you don't have the file, you can still follow along and copy the settings that I'm using. To get started today, let's hop back over to the Landscape Shaping tab and click on the very first node here, the File node. And if you downloaded directly from Gumroad, this node will most likely be baked. So first thing we need to do is unbake the node, and that will give us access to the file path. So now let's bring in the previously exported height map. And you'll see here that the elevation is quite intense. So there's a couple ways to go about this. We could use an adjustment layer to clamp it, or we can adjust it via the project settings. So if you go to Project, Build Settings, and then down to Terrain, you can adjust the terrain definition, and this will automatically scale the maximum heights. Now, you could give it a good guess as to your definitions based on these examples below, or you could Google, if you know the exact location and name of the mountain, the height. And here I found that the volcano that we are using is 854 meters tall. So I'm going to plug that in. However, something to keep in mind, this will put a permanent clamp on your entire project. So if you wanted to use an additive mask or adjustment layer, that addition to the maximum height will just be cut off. So the best practice that I have found to use is to actually double this height. And from there, that gives you some headroom to do some addition masks if you so want. So here I'm going to go with 1720 instead of the previous height. And then from there, we can have that height using an adjustment layer. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. Using an adjustment layer, let's go down to the clamp. And if you right click on the numbers, you can manually input. Here I put 0.5, and this is the realistic scale of these mountains. However, because I'm going to be making this more of a gamified representation, I'm going to go with a heroic scale and bump it up just a little bit to 0.6. Okay, that's looking pretty good. The next node we have is the soft clip, and that was for turning down the rough edges on a lower resolution height map. But since this height map is pretty good, we're just going to bypass that one and go straight to the rivers. So there are two ways to approach rivers with this. We can go for an artificially generated version, and Gaea will take care of randomly placing rivers. Or if you want to keep it more realistic, you can bring in your own river mask by drawing over Photoshop or masking it yourself, and then again importing the mask separately. But before we get to that, I know for a fact we are going to need to mask out the island themselves, separating the ocean from the land. This is going to be a very useful mask for several reasons, so let's go ahead and create that now. I'm going to right click on the body of the graph and type in adjust to grab an adjustment layer. Go ahead and connect that to the previous adjustment layer, and then we're going to head over to the clip, and we're going to clip the bottom and then the very top of the island down to almost nothing so that we mask out the very bottom of the island right where it touches the water. And again here, I'm right clicking on the numbers to put in a manual input in order to really get things exact. So from here, let's add another adjustment layer by right clicking and typing adjust. And this adjustment layer, we're going to want to equalize and use a strong adjustment filter in order to really harden the edges and get a mask. So now that we have a node that clearly differentiates the land from the water, we can use this in a variety of places, from generating rocky edges or sandy edges to texturing. So in order to use this easily on another part of the graph, I'm going to draw out one more adjustment layer. And then to expand the node, I'm going to double click on it. And from there, you can right click and rename. Let's rename this one to Island Mask. And if you right click on the out portion, you can go to Manage Portals by pressing P on the keyboard and create an out portal. And this will make it easier to reroute it to different parts of the graph or different tabs later on. And then also, we're going to need to invert this. It'll be more useful later on as an inverted mask. Now this is something that Gaea 1 used to do automatically, but in Gaea 2 you need to change it manually. If you want to visualize this as a mask instead of a height field, you can do so by going to the upper right and changing it there. The visualization though might still be bugged, I'm not sure. It still shows the height field below the mask, so it can be a bit confusing this way. But now that we have our mask figured out, let's move on to start generating our rivers. There's two ways, again, as I said before, you can go about this. You could bring in your own river mask, or you can generate them yourself using Gaea's tools. Here I'm using the river node, and I'm going to be playing around with the seed settings until I find a layout that I like. You can see that I set the water and the width to pretty high values. This is because in Unreal we are going to be doing a visual representation of the river, and if the water is too thin, it can get a bit lost in the resolution, so I set those pretty high. Here I found a layout that was pretty good, so I'm just going to open up Notepad again and save that seed value, and I'm going to keep trying until I find something that fits a little better. But if I don't find anything, I can hop back to that previous seed value, no problem. Okay, so after about 5 minutes of searching, I came across this particular seed value, and I think it works with the landscape quite well, so let's move forward with this one. As you can see, the rivers have extended far outside of the island into the ocean area, so we're going to be bringing in the island mask that we made previously to mask off those areas. I'm going to add a combine node and then bring over the island mask to that combine, and then set that node to subtract. So let's go over to the ratio here and turn it up a bit and see how it's cutting in. I'm noticing that the cut is a bit more inland than I'd like, so I'm going to add a blur node here and connect that blur node to the second input of that combine. Things are getting a bit tight, so let's move these nodes over a bit. Down pretty low so it isn't too extreme. Now let's go back to our combine node and check the radius again. And the cut is still pretty inland and still pretty harsh, so I think I need to go back to my island mask and adjust the values just a little bit. So on this first adjustment node here, I'm going to adjust the clip value down to 0.02. And I can see now it's getting that edge of the island that we missed before. And that should create a better mask than what we had previously. Now let's go ahead back to the combine node and take a look at the ratio again. And yeah, it's creating a much nicer, smooth drop-off. This we can work with. So things are looking good, but I'm still noticing a bit of artifacting inside of the ocean area. So let's add one more adjustment node, and we're just going to clip the bottom of our height map until it all smooths out and is perfectly flat. So I'm going to bring up the clip value to about 0.01, and that's looking much cleaner. Okay, things are looking pretty good. So from here, let's connect this adjustment layer down to the blur node here, as well as we're going to connect it to the ground node, the ground texture node beside it. And I'm going to just organize a little bit and explain the purpose of these next few nodes here. So in the Unreal visualization side of things, I have a simple river system set up for visualization purposes, but there are some restrictions to the maximum angle that those rivers can take. So I'm basically blurring the landscape and then deriving a slope value and masking the rivers that go below that slope value in order to restrict the river mask to a flat or near flat region of the map. This will help later on, and it'll become clearer in the next tutorial. The ground texture node is just adding a bit more detail to the landscape itself. It's not necessary, but I like to do it to add a bit more grit. If you were to go to the route of creating your own water mask or river mask to use, you would put it into the file node here. This could be done by tracing it in Photoshop from a Google satellite image. And then from the end of this node chain, you want to connect it into that same combine node up here. And that will get you essentially the same result, but with real world conditions rather than generated conditions. One quick node setup that we need to get together before we move on is a mask for both the ocean water and the river water separately. Apologies for not recording this in advance, but all I'm doing is taking the blurred island mask node we made previously and putting it into the combine node using a subtract and setting that ratio to 1. So we're subtracting the ocean water from the river water. Then we're just going to adjust that so we can clip all the excess mask that we don't need until finally we put it into one last adjustment node. And on this node, we're going to use the equalize to bring it to a full white and a full black so it works well as a mask. Make sure to right click and make a portal for the end of it so we can use it in later graphs. But that's about it for the landscape shaping tab. Next, we're going to move on to the masking tab, where we will create general material masks for Unreal Engine and for the vegetation. Jumping on over to the masking tab, here you can see the exports on the right, and on the left here we have choke point nodes, and these nodes connect to the previous tab. Because we're not using a river mask on the previous tab, we're not going to be using these nodes either, so I'm going to go ahead and remove them. This particular grass node is actually coming from the Vegetation tab. We'll get more to that later. And over here on the right, you can see all of our export nodes nicely organized and in order. These are going to be the masks in our landscape later on in Unreal. Okay, let's get started and go through these nodes individually, starting with the landscape choke point here. I'm using a height and sunshine node in order to drive the snow node here. And while this is an island that probably never has and never will have snow, I'm going to leave this node in just for some variance in the landscape texturing. And since the snow node does affect the height map slightly, I'm going to create a separate height map node there and create a portal for use later. Here I'm going to adjust the snow settings just a bit. I don't think this island needs too much snow, as unrealistic as it already is. So I'll just be adjusting the settings here a bit. Alright, that looks like a good amount of snow. So let's move on to start producing the rest of the landscape masks. Here we have the first three masks, the slope, ground A, and ground B material masks for the landscape in Unreal. And these are simply slope nodes that are adjusted to have slightly different settings. At higher slopes, a different rock material will be shown, so I'm trying to emulate that by isolating certain slope values from each other. Let's jump back to the river mask node, and here we're going to combine with the snow, and then finally combining again with the topmost cliff slope node in order to give us a zone that emulates the area of the landscape that's not too steep, but flat enough to hold loose rocks. Let's jump down to producing our overall landscape normal map. And the first node that I use generally for this to add a little bit more grit and detail to the landscape is the anastomosis node. Don't ask me what that means, but it does produce a nice layer of normalized grit and variance in the landscape itself. It's not entirely apparent at the 1K resolution, but it does add a little bit of variation in grit. After that, we have a couple more nodes to add that last touch of detail to the landscape. We have the roughen node, and then finally the ground texture node connecting to our landscape normal node. And notice on our landscape normal settings, we are using the detail type. This will allow us to apply the normal map to the entire landscape. It does this by averaging out the overall slope of the landscape and only showing the normal on the small variations there within. Next up, we have another node that is actually being driven by a future mask in the Vegetation tab. This is our tree fall and forest texture mask for leaves and various debris underneath trees. This can be adjusted later and is based on the trees in the following tab. But before moving on, we have one more thing to take care of in the masking tab, and that is our river and dead zone masks. So here at the beginning you have the choke points again from the previous landscape shaping tab, passing that through a blur and then a clip node, and then finally a warp node in order to give it a bit of variation, and that is going to become our sand and gravel mask. That rough edge variation is going to help complete the look. Then from our river mask here, it's going to go through a quick adjustment and blur into an erosion node. And this erosion node is going to give it a very naturalistic edge. And finally, from that erosion node, we have another clipping node that is going to become our riverbank material node. And then off the same blur, we're going to do a different clip with slightly higher min and max values. And that will give us our river basins. Whether or not you want to use any of these material transitions is up to you and your project. Within the riverbank and the river basin and the river edge, it can all be one material if you so desire. The last material node that we're going to make here is very important for the upcoming Vegetation tab. This node is an adjustment node named to be called the dead zone. And the dead zone is simply an area where plants are not allowed to grow. For this project, it's going to be the snow and the river basin, but it could be driven by several different combinations if you so choose in your own project. Okay, let's move on to the Vegetation tab. And here at the very beginning, you can see our two choke points again. We have here the dead zone that we just created. Again, that includes the snow and the river. I also brought over with a choke point the river bed node. We're going to be using this node to generate the flow A and flow B vegetation masks. And here at the very bottom, you can see an example of a common bug in Gaea 2.0. Hopefully it gets fixed in the future. Portals will every once in a while get disconnected, and then if you try to delete and fix them, it will cause a crash, which you can sometimes just ignore and then replace the portal with what it needs to be originally, or sometimes it will actually crash. In this case, I got lucky. I was able to fix this particular vegetation mask. And this is number 17. This mask is for whatever you want. In my case, I made it a snowy tree mask. So using the snow portal, I connected the snow to the vegetation mask. And here you can have snowy trees if you wanted to use that. Let's hop back up to the Heightmap choke point again. And here we're going to generate our most prosperous vegetation. These are vegetation nodes, by the way, if you're looking for them in Gaea 2.0. But with these vegetation nodes, we're going to produce the large trees and the small trees that cover most of our landscape. You can see right now that our settings are a bit limited. The slope value is a bit too small for the trees to grow up the edge, so we're going to make some adjustments to the large tree settings to make it a lush forest throughout the island. I'm going to speed up this next section here for a bit as I adjust the settings to get the trees just right. Here I'm double checking to make sure that the dead zone mask is actually working with the trees, and it looks like it is. So we're good there. We're just going to make the trees a bit more dense, a bit more lush, and dial in the settings just a bit more. All right, moving on to the small trees. We're going to do the same thing here. I want the small trees to be in the valley. So again, I'm just going to play around with settings until I get the look and feel that I want. The trees are getting a little bit too close to the riverbed and the snow, so I'm adding an adjustment to the dead zone to make it a bit more expansive, using a blur and then the shaper part of the adjust node to expand out the dead zone in order to cut back the trees from the edge of the water. And we're back to adjusting the small tree settings again, going for the correct look and feel. I'm jumping back and forth between the vegetation node and the dead zone node to make sure that I'm cutting back the vegetation just the right amount from where I don't want it. And I jumped back over here to the snow node because I wanted to adjust how much snow there was on the island. There was a bit too much previously. And here we are. That's just about right. I think everything's looking good. We can move on to the combined tree fall node, with which we are going to mask the landscape again. In the previous tab, we talked about it. This is the area under the trees where there will be some maybe some leaves or debris. All right, let's move on to the shrubs. Same thing as before. We want to just play around with the settings until we get the shrubs in the right areas and looking the way we want. Okay, so with shrubs A looking good, we're going to move on to shrubs B and adjust those so that they are in a slightly different area to give more biodiversity. And we're going to adjust those settings. And I'm going to connect to the dead zone adjustment layer to this again to cut it back just a bit, make sure it's not in the water. And that looks good. Now we can move on to the grass masks. You can tell right off the bat that our flow and grass masks are going to need some adjustments. I'm checking the river mask there, but since these vegetation masks are simply driven by slope and altitude, simply adjusting settings will get you the desired look eventually. Here I'm going to connect the adjusted dead zone mask to give the grass a bit more of a pushback away from the water's edge. And I'm going to apply this to all variations of the grass masks. I'm using several different grass masks in order to create some color variation that is going to be driven later on in Unreal by the RVT, Runtime Virtual Texture variation in the grass. But this is entirely optional, and you can ignore these masks A and grass mask B if you do not want to use those variations. Give me a moment while I adjust some settings and get those masks in proper position. Okay, those are looking good. We can move on to the flow mask. And this is vegetation that is going to be near the water's edge. And as such, we're going to be using the river mask brought over using a choke point node from the masking tab in order to drive or inhibit where the the flow vegetation is going to be spawned. And I'm realizing now that this is going to need a bit of adjustment to make it work. Right now the river is too thin for the vegetation to spawn inside and around of due to the resolution. So I'm going to have to expand it out by using the river bank node instead. And we're going to bring that over into the choke point by deleting the previous portal and adding in a new one. Here is river bank. And now that should be good enough to spawn some vegetation inside of if we adjust the settings just a little bit. And here I'm using the handy blur node again to expand the edges even more to give it a bit more space to spawn vegetation. And again, in conjunction with that blur node, we're going to use the shaper adjustment on the adjustments node to push that expansion out towards the edges. If we increase the strength of the blur, the shaper will then be able to expand the shape further based on the strength of that blur. This is a handy little trick that I use frequently to help increase the size of my masks. Okay, with that mask looking good, we can now invert the mask so that we have space inside of the river to spawn the vegetation. And now since the mask is inverted, that means I need to go the opposite direction with the shaper to push the shape the other direction. Now it's just a matter of adjusting the flow settings so that the plants fit in the mask. It's a bit of a struggle here with the 1K resolution, but with a bit of adjustment and finagling, we will get it to work. Here I'm going to turn on Visualize Data, and that setting allows us to easily visualize these minute settings changes that we're making. You can see exactly how all these settings are interacting with each other. You'll see here in a bit. It is a very easy to see blue, red, and green mask that adjusts according to how your inputs are changing. For example, here, as I start to use the dead flow setting, you can see these veins of red coming into the green mask, showing exactly how that dead flow is affecting the simulation bias and data. Please wait just a moment. I'm going to make some adjustments so that our flow A and flow B masks are slightly varied, and adding a bit of diversity to the bank around the river. All right, that's looking pretty good. All that work for just a little bit of vegetation, but it's going to be worth it in the end. This last node, the custom node, you can take it or leave it. It's open for any extra variation of vegetation that you want to add. It can be used to add snowy trees to the snow zone like I had previously, or just a separate variation of trees if you want to throw in a different species or a different size. That's up to you. I'm going to leave it in, but I don't think I'm going to be using it this project, maybe next time. But I will fix the settings so that it is working properly with the island in case you do want to use it. All right, I'm going to use the rest of this time here to just quickly adjust, thicken the forests and the small tree masks, and make sure everything is looking good before we move on to the final tab. But before moving on, we're going to need to compile the grass texture masks. And you can see again that Gaea is once again giving me an error with the portals, having blank portals. So we're going to need to quickly fix that. And in case you run into this in the future and they haven't fixed it yet, the way to fix it is just delete the portal and add it back in. It's a bit of a waste of time, but until they fix the bug, it's unavoidable. So now these two combined nodes are just adding and subtracting together the various grass masks in order to get a combined grass throughout the entire island. And this will be used later in the texturing. And now that we have our grass texture, we also need to account for where the tree fall will interfere with where the grass is growing, where leaves and debris will lay on top of the dirt. So we're going to need to subtract the grass from the tree fall in order to get that area. And here again, we're just using a variety of blur and then equalize adjustment nodes in order to get a strong black and white mask of all the grass areas that we're going to be using in our project. All right, now that all of our vegetation and vegetation-related material masks are created, we can then bring them over to our export node setup here. And I have them all separated with portals just to make it a bit more clear, organized, and concise. Here I'm clicking on all of the nodes to make sure that they're loaded and working properly. This is just a mix of blur and adjustment layers in order to get a nice strong black and white mask so that the values translate well into Unreal Engine when we're spawning vegetation using PCGs and grass masks as part of the landscape material. Here, again, we're running into the Gaea portal bug. So just like before, we're going to have to delete the portal and then replace the portal. This happens very frequently, and until they fix it, you're probably going to have to do the same, unfortunately. Just give me a sec, and I am going to fix all of these nodes to make sure that our exports will work properly. Okay, now that our exports seem to be working, let's head over to the very last tab, Texturing. This tab isn't necessary for the export, but it is nice as a checkpoint to see that everything is working properly and your landscape looks good before you export everything to Unreal Engine. The basic premise of this texturing tab is to take all the masks from the previous tabs and give them some color so you see how they all work together and hopefully how they look in Unreal. So here at the beginning of the graph, you see a texture-based node followed by 3 sat maps. This is to give the landscape a basic coloration before we start to add in the additional masks. We're using a couple slope and flow nodes in order to naturally divide the colors and combine them with these 2 separate combine nodes. The next combine node is for the grass, and for that particular combine node we're going to have to add in our main grass mask. So let's just click on the node here, go to Portal, delete out the mask that Gaea has glitched out, and let's add in that main grass mask at the bottom. Be careful of the icons. You don't want to use the foliage icon as denoted by the tree. You want to use the one here at the bottom. Alright, the next mask is the Grass A mask. So again, let's go to Manage Portal, delete out the old mask there, and let's add in our Grass A here at the bottom. And you can see the color starting to come through and that delineation in the grass color showing up. Same thing as before for Grass B. Alright, that's looking pretty good. And if any time you want to change these colors and adjust them to your preference, just click on the saturation map node at the bottom and you can adjust the colors there or use completely different colors. I'm going to go ahead and speed through these next few nodes, starting with the sand and rock node, same as before, changing out the mask using the manage portals. Next we have the snow node, or the snow mask. Followed by the small tree mask. Naturally followed by the large tree mask. And importantly, these 2 nodes that are floating above the small and large tree masks are the underlay nodes. And this is to project the trees back onto the landscape. And you can use any node as an underlay by simply right-clicking on it and selecting the option Use as Underlay. So now we have a feel for how dense the trees are in the landscape and how they feel in general. I think I need to go back and adjust the blending a little bit so that the trees have proper coloration. So that's what I'm going to do here in the combine node. I'm going to change it over to blend and adjust the ratio until the trees have a nice coloration to them. Okay, things are looking pretty good, but I think I went a little bit too extreme with the difference in coloration between our greens here. So I think really quickly I'm going to go back to my sat maps, saturation map nodes, and I'm going to adjust these colors to be a little bit less vibrant. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let's move on to the last part here, the water. So we're going to do the oceans and the rivers next. The water coloration is a bit special since we want it to look realistic and have some gradients applied. We're going to be using the clutter instead of the normal sat map in order to get our coloration. So here in the open space, I'm going to actually add a soil node, and this will give us the gradient that we want on the edges of the island. So on the soil mask here, we are going to use a portal to connect the island mask node that we made way back in the masking tab. And now we're just going to adjust the amount and bias until we have a nice gradient that will serve as a gradient between the shore and the deep blue sea. I couldn't quite get it as strong as I wanted using just the soil node, so we're going to add an adjustment node and then really beef up that gradient so that it's pretty stark, and then invert the gradient so that the coloration goes from white to black instead of black to white. But a simple stark gradient won't have quite enough variation for my liking. To make it a bit more ocean-like with the foam and the shadows on the waves, let's add in a texturizer node, and then using a portal, mask it off with the island mask, and that will give us a nice variation. I'm going to play around here with the texturizer type, and then the factor, secondary, and the seed values until I get a nice gradient and variation in the water surface. Okay, we have our base texture ready for the water. So before we move on, let's combine the two together using a combine node and putting it to power. And then let's adjust the ratio until we get a mix of the two that we like. Now, just like with the river color, we're going to be using a clutter node to give this water a nice blue gradient. So for the deepest part of the ocean, I'm going to choose a dark navy, and the shoreline will get a light teal color. And after playing around with the colors for a little bit, I realize I need a bit more variation. So instead of using a clutter node, I actually think I'm going to use another saturation map, sat map node. And we're going to go through the library of colors here and choose a blue gradient that has that shoreline variation that we're looking for. Now let's use another combine node and blend these two gradient variations together in order to get a mix that fits our purposes. Okay, that's looking pretty good as a tropical blue. Let's add a combine node and combine this with the landscape that we've textured already. Just going to darken up the ocean a little bit more, just to give it a bit more depth. And that's looking pretty good. Let's move on next to exporting our masks and getting everything prepped and prepared for Unreal Engine. To start exporting, let's hop back over to our masking tab, and over on the far right, nice and organized, we have all of our exports here. A nice part of Gaea 2 is that we have a new special node specifically for Unreal. It's called the Unreal node, and this will export all of our masks at the resolution perfect for Unreal Engine landscapes. Before exporting, it's good practice to click through all of your export nodes and make sure that things are all loading properly. Especially if, like me, you're using portals to keep your graphs organized. Sometimes those links can get disconnected, so make sure to double check before you start your export. If you need to make any additional exports, just right-click and create a new Unreal node and connect whatever mask you've created to that. Before exporting, we should take a quick look at our build settings. Click on Project in the top dropdown. And on the left-hand side here, under the build settings, we are interested in the build destination. By default, it will put all of your builds where your project file is saved, but you can adjust exactly what folder you want to send it to here. Once all your nodes are error-free and you have your build destination set, go ahead and go back up to Project and click Build and Export on the top. This will give you a little dialog alerting you that you're about to start the build and double check your build resolution. We could build it at a slightly higher resolution, but since we are using the free version, we are limited to 1024 by 1024. But for our purposes, that should be just fine. Go ahead and click Start Build and wait for the build to finish. What's nice about Gaea 2 is that builds don't take nearly as long as they used to, so you won't have to wait too long. And there you go. Once your build is finished, all of your images will be exported to the directory that you set earlier. And if everything with the build went well, you should see all of your masks in PNG format, as well as your heightmap in .r16, which is the preferred format for grayscale images to be used for heightmaps in Unreal Engine, as well as some JSON files at the end named definition and report, in case you need to debug any issues with the build, if there were any. But fortunately for me, looks like everything went through, so let's head on over to Unreal Engine and build our landscape. Okay, let's hop over to Unreal. If you've picked up my files on Gumroad, go ahead and open the Gaea 2 Unreal scene. If you're doing this from scratch, you can go ahead and make a brand new project. We'll be going over quite a bit of the workflow here, but there are certain parts of it that we won't be touching on, such as in-depth tutorial on the landscape material and a super in-depth tutorial on how the PCG gets put together. But we're going to go over broad strokes, so you should be able to use this tutorial in conjunction with a couple others to get something pretty similar. Alright, when you first open up the file, if you've watched the first tutorial that I made, this will probably look somewhat familiar. It's a previous map that we made. But for this tutorial, we're going to start with a brand new level. So right-click on your content browser and let's make a new level. Go ahead and name that level whatever you want and save it. Before we move on though, let's go ahead and jump over to the outliner and let's copy all of our sky items here. It will save us a lot of time setting up our new level if we can just copy and paste these over. And this is just a simple setup of sky atmosphere, direct light, etc., etc. Pretty standard. Okay, from here we're ready to import our landscape. So go over to the top landscape tab and go to import from file at the top. And here we can import our heightmap file that we exported from Gaea previously. So go ahead and select the .r16 file labeled heightmap and let's import that. Right now you'll notice that it's a bit out of scale based on our wireframe preview here, so let's mess around with our scale values. And in fact, we already know what scale we need to be using. We set it up previously with our Gaea file setup. So let's take a quick look back at our Gaea build settings in regions, and we'll see right there in the middle our height scale ratio is 0.09. We're going to be using this ratio in Unreal as well. So hopping back to Unreal, if we simply put 100 by 100 by 9, Our landscape is going to be pretty small because of the restraints on the resolution. So we're actually going to 10x the size just to give our game a large open world feel. So here I'm going to go with 1000 by 1000 by 90, and I think that's a good size. The rest of the settings down below are automatically set by the imported heightmap file, so if they're ever changed, go ahead and click Fit to Data to change them back to the default. And I think we're ready to go. Go ahead, click Import, and our landscape will pop into the editor. And just taking a quick look around, our height seems just right. But we'll notice on the edge that we have a wall, and this is a common issue with tiling in Unreal Engine, but luckily this is a quick fix. Just take out your Flatten Sculpt tool, turn the strength all the way up and the size all the way up, and let's just move around the perimeter and flatten that back out. This could be a factor of the R16 file type and how it tiles in Unreal. I imagine that the tiling is causing a very thin white band to appear at the edge of the image, and Unreal is reading that white edge as a high point in the height map, and thus creating this wall. If we were using a normal landscape that wasn't water and ocean in this area, and thusly completely flat and completely low, then we might not have this issue, or it could be a factor of the R16 file type. But regardless, we got it all cleaned up and we're good to go. Before continuing any further with the landscaping tab, we need to add a material to our landscape. So go ahead and go over to the landscape materials folder, and in here we have a master material and a material instance. You can go ahead and create a new instance of the landscape master material, or an instance of the existing instance, and that will give you the settings that are used on the previous level. And those are a bit more refined and will take a little less work. Alright, let's hop back over to the landscaping tab. You'll see here soon that our landscape is going to turn black. That's okay. We will fix that in a bit. But first thing we need to do is get some layers on our landscape. So go ahead and click on the Paint tab at the top. And if you go all the way to the bottom under the Layers dropdown, you'll see an option called Create Layers from Assigned Materials. And to explain where that comes from, let's go ahead and open up our master material. And don't get too intimidated at first. Essentially, all this is textures on the left with some nodes for creating variation and tiling. And they're all connected to this very important node called Landscape Layer Blend. The Landscape Layer Blend node is essentially in charge of tracking and storing how and where all of the materials on the landscape are placed, and whether or not they are blended into each other or simply placed on top of each other. As soon as we click the button Create Layers from Assigned Materials, all of those layers that we have set up inside the material will show up here. And if you click on the drop down for each of these, you'll see that we already have a landscape layer associated with each of these. This is something that Unreal will generate, and it was generated previously for the previous landscape. You can see it in the landscape shared assets there. But for example, if you have a new material or a new layer, and you need to generate a new landscape layer info, just click the plus icon and then choose weight blended layer or non-weight blended layer. The weight blended layer will, as the name implies, blend, and the non-weight blended layer will simply stack. But we don't need that for now. Let's delete that. And now we need to jump back over to our landscape and adjust our RVTs so we can actually see the materials that we're adding. RVTs, or runtime virtual textures, are basically Unreal's way of, on demand at runtime, creating texel data over an entire landscape. Essentially making a decal that pastes over the entire landscape that you can use to determine grass coloration or blending plants and rocks into the landscape. And it is super useful for creating homogeneous landscapes that look visually appealing. So we're going to do that here. But first things first, you need to activate it for your project if you haven't already in your project settings. So let's quickly go to our project settings and type into the top search virtual texture, and then go ahead and select the checkbox enable virtual texture support. And after that, you will probably need to restart your editor, but then virtual texture should be working. Next thing we need to do is add the virtual texture assets to our map itself. So if you haven't already, go ahead and open Window and then make sure you have the Place Actors window open. And from this window, go ahead and search for virtual texture. And the runtime virtual texture volume should come up. Go ahead and drag and drop 2 of those into your map. Just to keep things organized, I'm going to put them in a folder named RVT. And then let's change the names of both of these to RVT_height. And then the second one to RVT_color. And these correspond to the rendered texture types that are going to be associated with them. If you go back to your content browser, you can right-click and create a new texture called Runtime Virtual Texture. If you're making these from scratch, you'll need to set the virtual texture content appropriately. Luckily, I have these made already, so go ahead and copy these settings. Here are the settings for RVT color. And here are my settings for world height, RVT height. Since we already have these set up, let's just use the ones we already have. For RVT color, go ahead and drag and drop the RVT color named Runtime Virtual Texture. And then on the Bounds Align actor, make sure you select the landscape and click Set Bounds. After that, we're going to do the same for RVT height. Drag and drop it into the RVT height volume, bounds align factor to the landscape, and set bounds again. We are almost there, just one more setting. There are still RVT settings to do in the landscape actor itself. So go ahead and click on the landscape and scroll all the way down until you see Draw in Virtual Textures. There's 2 boxes here, and as you guessed, one is for color and the other is for height. And just like that, we can finally see our landscape material. I'm going to hop back over to landscape mode and quickly delete out some of the material that we have saved already, and let's start from scratch. So just go over to Paint and right click on the very first layer and Fill Layer. Alright, we're finally ready to start applying the masks that we exported from Gaea. So back in landscape mode, head over to the Manage tab, and here underneath the Layers dropdown you can see that we have all of our landscape layers ready to accept our masks that we exported from Gaea. So by clicking on these 3 little dots, you can import the masks, first starting with the base rock layer, followed by ground A, and then ground B. I like to split these up into 3 masks at a time. If you try to import too much, it could cause a crash due to how much the shader needs to compile. So I like to take things a little slow. Once you have the 3 masks brought in and linked, we're going to scroll to the bottom and click the Import button. And just like that, we have the first look at how our landscape is going to be textured. Looking pretty good so far. Let's go ahead and continue importing our masks. Clicking on import. Yeah. And you can see how all of these masks layer on top of one another to create a varied and interesting landscape material. Next we have lake, snow, and sand. While that's preparing, I'm going to go ahead and bring in riverbank and riverbed and prepare them for import. Yeah, everything's looking good there. Go ahead and import the last two. Yeah, looking good. Let's go ahead and hop back into landscape mode and import our last non-weight blended masks, Grass A and Grass B. And essentially non-weight blended masks will sit directly on top of our existing material and will not have any fade or blending. It will just be a direct stamp, as it were. And we're going to use these to color the grass and create a bit more variety and variegation. You can see with those shaders now compiled that the coloration is different, a bit brighter in patches and then a bit darker in others. Yeah, I think it adds a bit of variety and visual interest that really helps out landscapes. Zooming in on the face of the rocks here, I can tell that the tiling needs a bit of work, both with near and far tiling. This is usually at the time in the project when I would spend some time getting all these values really tuned in. But I don't want to waste too much of your time going through all of these values, so I'm just going to skip ahead to where the material is looking correct and good. So let's go ahead and skip there. All right, now that the material tiling is looking good throughout the landscape, we can move on. One thing we haven't touched yet is actually bringing in our masks from Gaea to replace the ones that are inside the material themselves. You can see that the landscape normal map from a previous build is still in the material, so we need to replace those with our new build. So next thing we need to do is bring in our masks from Gaea. Let's go ahead and make a new folder. I'm going to name it Gaea Build 2. And then from the directory, I'm just going to drag and drop all of the masks that we exported from Gaea previously. Okay, go ahead and save your new import. And before we move on to plugging it into the material, we need to make one big change to all of these. So select them all, right-click, and go to Asset Actions. And then from there, go to Edit Selection in Property Matrix. And this will allow you to make changes to all of your selections at once, saving a bit of time. Inside the Property Matrix, we're going to be looking for padding, and we want to change that to stretch to power of 2. This is important for how the texture tiling is going to work within the PCGs later on, so taking care of it now will fix any future bugs. So clicking on one of these, I'm just going to double check that stretch to the power of 2 is on and the type is for UI. And we're good to go. Let's go ahead and open up our material again, and we're going to search for normal, and we're going to replace the landscape normal map with our newly generated one. Now you can see those wrinkles in the landscape are gone. And in fact, we have sort of a wave normal around the edge of the island. And the normals are looking much nicer. One thing we're missing still is the grass maps. So let's just double check that our foliage maps are properly replaced. And I can can see I can get a better search if I type in foliage to see all of the maps. And in fact, yes, we do need to replace all of these textures. So go ahead and activate those. And then we're going to drag and drop our new main grass, grass A, grass B, and dead zone textures into the existing slots. Alright, now that those are in, you can expect grass to start appearing on your landscape. However, I have noticed that in recent versions of Unreal Engine, the grass maps do not automatically build as frequently. So there are a couple fixes that you can run. First thing, you should run the console command grass.enable and then -1 to make sure that grass is actually enabled on your project. I'm going to click the output log to confirm. Let's go back up to build and build grass maps only. And if you check the output log and there's no errors popping up, that means that the grass is properly building, but yet we still don't see it. So one thing I want to try is to flush the cache, just to double check. And again, yes, cache is flushed. Let's try building one more time. And if the grass still doesn't show up, you probably just have to reopen your level. Here in 5 times speed, I'm going to try a couple more things that end up not working, but such is the way of bug fixing. Until finally just save and reopen, and there we go. The grass is here. Sometimes the simplest answer is the best. Here I'm going to do a quick fly around to check that the edge of the grass is properly stopping at the edge of the grass material on the landscape. And it's looking pretty good. Let's have a quick look at how grass maps are working inside of our landscape material. Up here at the top in the green box, we have the texture sample nodes that hold the Gaea masks that we imported previously. And over just to the left, we have our dead zone connected to the UVs, which is coming from our landscape coordinates node. Very important value here. The mapping scale is set to 1009, and this reflects the resolution of our mask images and our height map. If you are exporting from Gaea at a higher resolution than 1009 by 1009, make sure that the mapping scale inside of your landscape coordinates matches that resolution size. From here you can see that our UVs are rerouted to our dead zone mask, and then from there rerouted to the dead zone within our grass mask calculations. Here we also have a switch to turn on and off the grass if we want. And the very last node is our landscape grass node. Inside that node, you can select your grass type and take a look at the types there within. Here you can change the static mesh and the materials. We'll take a quick look at the RVT settings of the grass material. You can see if you raise the RVT blend amount, the grass will move away from the landscape color and more into its own material color. And the closer that number gets to 0, the more the grass will blend into the landscape. Now that we have the land looking pretty good, I want to spend some time and shift our focus towards making the island look more like, well, an island. The first step is to go to your plugins and turn on Unreal Engine's experimental water plugin. It will give you a warning about experimental version and ask you to restart your project. You may have to wait a little bit for the shaders to recompile. Once back in, we want to head over to the Place Actors window. Let's search for water, and we're going to go with water body ocean. To put it into the project, simply drag and drop from the Place Actors into the editor. And again, there's going to be a bit more compiling, but once it's ready, you'll notice that your landscape will go completely flat. Don't worry though, it's just a quick setting fix to get it back to normal. Simply click on Water Body Ocean. Scroll down until you see the checkbox Affects Landscape and uncheck. And your height map should pop back to normal. Give it a bit more time for your shaders to compile and the water should suddenly appear. You'll notice that the water might be a little bit too high. Simply reselect the water body ocean and drag it down on the Z-axis until it matches up with your landscape. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Next thing I always do when using an Unreal Engine plugin is that any material that an object from the plugin uses should probably be copied into the content browser. This is to prevent you from overwriting any engine content and possibly messing up the plugin and having to reinstall later on. So what I'm going to do is select the material from the ocean and I'm going to copy it into our Gaea 2 Unreal directory. I'm going to go down a little further and also make a copy of the water material. Alright, now with our new copies, we are safe to change any of the material instance settings and get the color to be a bit less fluorescent. Okay, now that our water is looking good, we can move on to our foliage PCGs. Because these PCG files here already have settings for a different level, we need to quickly make a new copy. And the best way to do that without having to replace any references manually is to use an advanced copy. So let's first make a new folder. I'm going to name this version 2. And then we're going to select all 3 of these files, drag it in, and select Advanced Copy here. I want to quickly rename these files to make sure we don't confuse them with the previous version. So I'm going to change Forest to Island. And I will do the same for the PCG within the blueprint as well. Quickly scroll down and double check that the reference was in fact updated properly and it looks good. The reason we're using a blueprint to hold the PCG is twofold. One, it allows us to store parameters that can be easily changed later with the use of a structure that is added in separately. And 2, it allows us to also insert some tools to quickly adjust the PCG settings, such as the box size in which the PCG operates within. So in order to use this blueprint, all you need to do is drag it into the map, and then on the editor window to the right here, there is a button called Set Bounds Landscape. And this is the box I was referring to earlier. It allows us to quickly set the bounds of where the PCG operates. This is important because the masks we have exported from Gaea are a very specific size, and they need to stretch perfectly over the landscape so our foliage is placed exactly where we want it to be. The first feature of the PCG that I put together is definitely experimental and not for production, more for just visualization. But it frustrated me that we couldn't get rivers from Gaea into Unreal in a quick and easy way. So I set up a spawn water system that spawns a slightly bent plane with normals that are completely vertical. And if you 3D model, you'll understand what that means, but I'll throw a graphic up on screen here to better explain. It definitely doesn't produce perfect results, but for visualization purposes, I think it works pretty well. Let's take a quick look at how the PCG graph itself is structured. So to start with placing the water, we are sampling the landscape data within the bounds of the mask we exported from Gaea. And if we take a quick look at the image mask itself, you can see that we're using the 06 Riverbank mask, but it's from the previous build, so we should go ahead and replace that with our new build. And you can see already that our river is placed more properly in the landscape. Here I'm just going to pan a little bit through the rest of the graph. The setup itself is pretty simple. You'll use a lot of these nodes again and again when sampling a landscape in order to spawn static meshes. There is one node here though in particular I want to make quick mention of, the transform points node. We are injecting it with the property water level. And what's nice about these properties is that we can control them from the blueprint rather than directly in the PCG. So this is how we're going to offset the water level on the z-axis in order to get it at the level that we need. Alright, a little further on at the end of our graph, finally we have the static mesh spawner, and inside of that spawner we have the water plane that we talked about previously. Again, this is just a slightly bent, sloped plane that can stack on top of itself and has completely vertical normals, so that the water seems flat, but can actually travel slightly downwards and upwards. If we take a quick look though, you can see that the water is a bit high, so we're going to adjust that previously mentioned water level until it fits with our landscape. Alright, the water level seems pretty good, but the color is definitely off, so we need to take the material from the ocean and reapply it to our water plane. And it seems I chose the wrong material. I need to go back and choose the other one. Alright, we're getting closer, but I think we still need to adjust the absorption and scattering that we did in the previous material. So I'm just going to do that now. Alright, our rivers are looking pretty good. Again, it's not a perfect system by any means. It's just for quick visualization. But I think the stacked bent planes do a pretty good job of showcasing a river without much effort. If you wanted to spend a bit more time and get a more accurate result, I do recommend using Unreal Engine's water tools. Their river spline does a pretty good job and is a bit more believable. Before we move on to the PCGs, there's one important upgrade to this new workflow that I wanted to point out, and that was the issue with our previous workflow using only grass masks. With grass masks, we can't have any collision, so its usefulness in a game is slightly limited, more for visualization if anything. But now with PCGs, it's easy to add collision to any of your assets, and they will spawn with the PCG as normal. So now you can have collision on your assets in addition to the procedurally generated distribution. Welcome back from that brief interruption. Now that we have the water squared away, let's move on to the main assets of our island. Just like previously with our water, we need to replace the mask that's inside of our get textured data node. And all of these spawners are set up similar, that these masks feed into the landscape sampler, so we can get points from Gaea's output. So I'm just going to put the large tree mask into the slot here and save. Don't worry if things aren't spawning right away. I have all these on switches, so we can work on them individually without overloading the PCG system. And here we are. You can see the placeholder trees. These are just low poly placeholders waiting to be replaced with some higher quality assets. I want to take another quick look at the mask and double check that our settings are correct, that we are in fact using stretch to the power of 2. And if I were to turn that off and to recompute the PCG, you'll see how our assets begin to misalign with the material mask on the landscape. So let's change that padding back to stretch to the power of 2. Save, and hopefully our assets will jump back to where they need to be. Okay, let's open up our PCG again and take a look at how the small trees work here. So again, just like before, we have our get texture data node with our mask connected to the surface sampler down below. And we need to replace the mask yet again with our new Gaea build. Oh, accidentally zoomed too far out there. And now we just need to click the checkbox to turn on small trees. And there they are. Looking pretty good. You can see here that our representation of the river is not perfect by any means. So I'm just going to lower that a little bit further and try to hide that ugly edge. Yeah, that's a bit better. If you ever run into a similar issue that bothers you, you could always go into the landscape mode and do a bit of sculpting around the edge of the river to raise up that part of the landscape and hide that ugly edge of the river static meshes. Well, let's go into fast forward mode here for a little bit, and let's put all of our Gaea build masks into the corresponding get texture data nodes. With all the new masks in place, all we need to do is click the checkboxes and turn all of our PCGs on. You can see with each one some new placeholder assets appear. There are our shrub assets there, just little cubes. But again, later on we're going to replace these with high quality assets and make this a more believable environment. Here I'm noticing that our bushes are actually spawning, our shrubs are spawning on top of one another. And this is probably because they have the exact same seed values. So I'm just going to quickly jump into the settings and we're going to change the seed value of the shrubs just so that they have a more random assortment. Okay, well, things are looking pretty good. Next I want to turn on the rock layer and take a look at how those are spawning. So let's jump back over and click the checkbox. Yeah, there they are, sort of scattered throughout the landscape. You'll notice that the rock locations aren't restricted by the water, and that's okay. That's how we had it masked. And if we turn on the flow, you'll see that the flow as well follows the riverbank, but also, depending on the location, will step into the river as well. These can be things like reeds or lotus, stuff that likes water. Let's take a quick look at the PCG graph and how it works on the inside. Again, it's not super complicated, but let's look at the beginning here with the property spawn tree S linked to a select node. And this is the easiest way that I'm aware of to be able to turn on and off parts of a PCG graph within the editor. This connects directly to a difference node that is driven by the dead zone, another mask that we exported from Gaea. And this is just a way to ensure that none of the plants or assets that are spawned will be within this quote-unquote dead area. Let's quickly turn on debug and show exactly what the PCG is computing with this. And you can see that it's actually our Gaea mask just sort of blanketing the landscape. If we go on to our density filter, you'll see that the edges that were black were then filtered out, and we have just the strongest part of the mask being used. If we go to the next, the self-pruning node, you'll see that those tons and tons of points that were really close together are pruned based on a set size, so that none of our assets are too close to each other and thus possibly clipping into one another. Next, we're using a projection node to make sure that none of our points are floating above the landscape and that they are aligned with the normal of the surface. With some assets, we will want to keep that surface normal, but for trees in particular, we're going to use a transform points node in order to make those stand straight up so that the trees grow more vertically and aren't positioned sideways. Since we've moved the points around just a little bit, we're doing another check against the difference to make sure that none of our points are within the dead zone yet again. And let's take a quick look at our dead zone because I think I forgot to replace the texture data for that. So let's do that quickly. That should have some big changes on the landscape. And yes, we're getting a lot more trees now. That's looking like the output we got from Gaea. That's good. Before I talk about the last three nodes on the PCG graph there, it segues really well into our next task, which is to replace all these placeholder assets with some good-looking high-fidelity assets. So let's jump back into our blueprint to see how these assets are accessed in the blueprint by use of parameters. So if we click on the PCG instance within the graph and scroll down, you should see a drop-down menu called Parameters Override. And if you open up all of these carets, you can see where all of our assets that are currently being used are stored. So let's jump back over to the graph and I'll show you exactly how this is set up. In order to utilize a parameter, first we need to make one. So go over to the right to your graph settings and create a new parameter by clicking the plus icon. And then we need to switch this over to a static mesh parameter. I should note that it could also be a foliage instance, but in this case I'm using static meshes. So now we can drag and drop any static mesh into this parameter and also rename it. We don't yet have access to it because we haven't saved and compiled, but once we do, you should be able to right-click on your graph and search for your new parameter. And now you have access to that parameter, both inside the PCG graph and the attached blueprint. I'm going to go ahead and delete the new parameter because we won't be needing it. Let's talk about the next node, Match and Set Attributes. This node communicates between the PCG and the blueprint graph that any changes in the static mesh selection within the blueprint should be reflected in the following node here, the static mesh spawner. One important note, make sure that the attribute name here matches exactly. Otherwise the graph will throw up an error when you compile. Additionally, make sure that your mesh selector type is set to PCG mesh selector by attribute. Let's jump back over to the blueprint and let's change out the large tree mesh so we can see this in action. To quickly accrue a variety of assets, I'm going to be using the sample project Electric Dreams. Feel free to use any asset packs that you already have, but this one is a very good free option that's available on the Unreal Engine website or on fab.com. Let's open up Electric Dreams and take a quick look at the folder structure. When merging two projects together, it's always important to take note of how the folders are laid out because the exact same folder with the exact same path will be copied over to your project. Looks like all the assets we could ever want are within the Megascans folder, 3D plants. So I'm just going to right click on the Megascans folder and then go up to migrate. Unreal Engine will then throw a list up showing you all the dependencies that you are about to migrate over. If everything looks alright to you, go ahead and click OK. I will note that because we are doing such a huge import, I made a copy of our project because from here on out the project file size is going to be much larger. So if anything breaks, it's always nice to have a place to go back to. Okay, with our new assets successfully imported, we can go ahead and start placing them into our blueprint. I'm going to be using the European hornbeam as the main tree in this file, so let's go ahead and just drag one in and see how it looks. You can see that even after changing the static mesh parameter, the PCG is a bit stubborn to change even when forcing a regeneration. I'm going to make a quick function to force regeneration in editor and see if that works. Dragging off of the function input, we're going to use the flush PCG cache. And this node is somewhat self-explanatory. Then I'll also do a notify properties changed from blueprint. I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to help, but sometimes it does, so I'm just going to add it in anyways. And then the last node we need is the refresh PCG runtime component. I'm noticing that the refresh PCG component actually has the flush cache option, so I'm going to delete the first node and then just check that on, and that should take care of both of those things. One last important step is to make sure that it's possible to call in editor. That will give us a button that we can actually click on. Unfortunately, this function didn't actually end up helping us out, but it is a useful thing to keep anyways, so I thought I'd keep it in the tutorial. Instead, I guess what is necessary in order to refresh the cache of these static meshes in the PCG graph is to just delete the PCG and to place it back into the level. We will need to reset our water settings and put it back to the level we had previously. But as soon as we turn on large trees, you can see that they actually pop in. So we're good to go there. We are having some issue though with the shader, so let's take a quick look at the material. Anytime you migrate Megascans assets, they have a tendency to break, so this is pretty common. But I think I know a quick fix. Let's open up the static asset and take a quick look at the materials. Here we have the material instance, and it is noting something about requiring non-virtual textures. So let's go to the parent. Right away, I notice that this substrate node here at the end is probably what our issue is. I don't know if our project settings are set up to use substrate, so we're just going to go ahead and delete that node and reconnect the material attributes to the output. Alright, looks like that fixed up a lot of our issue. And since it was the master material, it seems like all the other plants here also have been fixed. But let's just open one up and double check. Yeah, materials are looking good. So that seems to be the fix for now. Let's go ahead and dive back into the blueprint and we'll fill out the rest of the static meshes with some more of our assets here. So just going to click on the plus icon add a bunch more array objects, and let's go and add in some more of these trees so we get a nice variety in the landscape. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but this is a really nice consequence of using parameters inside the blueprint instead of directly using static mesh spawners, is that it's really quick to add an entire array of varying assets. I think I want to also add in some tree stumps and various other static meshes into this, so I'm going to go ahead and fix up some of the other materials. Once again, same thing with the stump mesh here. I need to get rid of that substrate and then reconnect. Alright, we got our blueprint back in, and the variety is looking pretty nice. Let's go ahead and fill in the assets for the rest of our parameters here. I don't want to make you wait while I choose all these assets, so let's just skip ahead to the end where all of our assets are in. Alright, I think we have all of our assets selected, so let's just click the checkbox and turn them on one by one and see how they look. Looks like there's another material I need to fix up here. That's fine. Same thing as before, most likely, just deleting the substrate node and reconnecting. Let's go back into our settings here and find that mesh so we can find that material. One small tip in case you don't already know, but you can simply hold down Shift when dragging from another node's input to drag that input to a new node input. It's a quick way so you don't have to reconnect and look around the graph too much. Having a quick look around here, there are some settings I want to change with some of the plant density. And I see that some of the plants are a little small, so let's get all of these turned on and we'll adjust the settings all together at once. Also, I'll show you how the settings structure interacts with the blueprint and the PCG graph. So to edit the settings of the PCG, simply click the down arrow on the PCG and then down arrow on the current settings, and here you can see all of the various asset settings listed out. The best way to store a multitude of settings like this is to use a structure. So let's go into the folder and open up the structure we have that stores all of our settings. Here you can see all the same settings listed out, along with the type of variable that it is. And if you go to the next tab over, you can see the default values that we have set up. Here's a good place to change any of the values that you feel that next time you want to use the PCG, they should be set to that by default. Jumping back into the blueprint, in order to use this structure, we're going to have to set it up as a variable to be referenced. When selecting the variable type, make sure and double check that the name is the one that you copied previously. In my case, PCG Gaea Settings 2. Now that we have a variable inside of our blueprint, we can then reference it back inside of our PCG using attributes. So let's open back up our PCG and I'll show you exactly how that works. Here I'm using the node getActorProperty. And then within the property name, make sure that you're using the same variable name that you set earlier when referencing your structure. Here I'm using current settings, so just to be sure I'm going to copy it and then go back over and paste it. That way, without a shadow of a doubt, it's the correct name. And in case I haven't mentioned it earlier, I am using quite a few reroute nodes, which you can make by typing in reroute. And it's just a way to keep the graph much cleaner and not have so many lines interconnecting. So the reroute from the current settings is then going to these 4 delete attribute nodes. make sure to change the operation setting from delete to keep only. And then the selected attribute, once again the name has to match exactly to the name within your structure. So again, copying and pasting is always a good idea, just so you don't mess up typing. All of the various settings in the structure are pointing to this particular surface sampler node and the various settings that you can access there. If you wanted to access more settings, you can click the down caret to access more. But points per squared meter, point extents, looseness, and seed are the most important in my opinion. Okay, now that we have these settings properly set up, let's take a look at what they actually do. I have the small trees here isolated along with the large trees, so it's easier to see what's going on. In order to change the overall density, I usually change the points per square meter setting, here called small trees per square meter. Scale min and scale max are also important to play around with. You can randomize the generation by changing the seed value to anything you want. The last important setting to take note of here is the point extents. And the best way I can use to describe this is creating a large box around each of these assets. If two boxes cross one another, that asset is culled. So it's a way to evenly space out the group of assets. The larger the box is, the larger the point extents are, the further spaced out the assets will be. Using these settings, I'm going to go ahead and set up the rest of the assets. But I don't want to make you wait through all of that, so let's just go into super speed here until I'm done. There is one extra setting here that I do want to point out, and that within this PCG settings we can play with the last transform points node in order to lower certain assets further into the ground. So the last of the three boxes here is your z-axis offset, and if you want assets to drop further into the ground, just make those a larger negative number. I'm actually seeing one more asset here that I forgot to mention, and this one in particular is inside of our grass types. Let's go back to our landscape materials folder and open up our grass types. And open up index 1, you'll see that we still have our flower placeholder that needs to be replaced. Going to quickly sift back through our Megascans assets and quickly replace out all of our indexes here. As you can see, similar to our PCGs, grass types also have a variety of settings that you can play with. Here I'm just going to adjust these ground cover assets to be a bit smaller and a bit less dense. And with that, our Gaea to Unreal plus PCG landscape is complete. I tried to be as thorough as I could with this tutorial while also staying concise. However, I know I probably skipped over quite a few topics, so if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. Otherwise, Have a wonderful week.